You know what keeps bothering me about this whole AI music conversation? It is not even the technology. It is the way people react to it. The speed of the panic, the tone of the panic. The fact that almost immediately the conversation collapses into ownership, theft, royalties, lawsuits, rights, catalogs, licensing, percentages. And I keep thinking, wow, is that really where we are now? Is that what music has become in our minds? Because when I look at the reaction, I do not just see fear of AI. I see something deeper. I see a civilization that has been trained to think of music primarily as a controlled asset, not as a human necessity, not as a mystery, not as one of the oldest things we ever did, but as a possession. And I think that is the part that should disturb us. Not because musicians do not deserve to make a living. We do, of course we do. But because somewhere along the way, we may have lost the order of things. Music first, money second, meaning first, ownership second, human expression first, industry after. And now I look around, and I wonder whether we have inverted the whole structure and started worshiping the frame instead of the painting. That is what bothers me. There is a line of thought I cannot get away from, and it goes back, strangely enough, not just to composers, but to C.S. Lewis. In Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis was already wrestling with the idea that humanity had fallen out of alignment with reality, that we had become estranged from something higher and cleaner and more ordered. The novel was published in 1938, and yet it was already haunted by the sense that modern man had become spiritually disordered. And there is this remembered image in my mind from that world. This attitude toward music that feels almost alien now. Someone plays something beautiful, and the impulse is not to trap it, package it, optimize it, force it into repetition until the thing is drained. The impulse is different. It belongs to another relationship with beauty. I am paraphrasing the spirit of what stayed with me, not quoting it exactly, but the feeling matters. Beauty is not always there to be owned, repeated on demand, milked for utility, or turned into product. Now compare that with us. Play it again, again. I said again. Clip it, loop it, monetize it, own it, register it, squeeze it, push it through the system. And if the system is threatened, panic. That is where I start asking questions. Are we reacting like musicians? Or are we reacting like frightened shareholders? Are we defending art? Or are we defending a structure that trained us to confuse art with property? Because look at the emotional center of the debate, not the slogans, the center. What are people actually upset about? Are they upset because something false might replace something true? Or are they upset because the machinery of scarcity is shaking? That is not the same thing. And maybe that is the thought people do not want to sit with. Maybe AI is not introducing the corruption. Maybe AI is becoming a mirror to it. Think about how old music is. Older than our industries, older than our contracts, older than our legal frameworks, older than the modern state as we know it. And now ask the uncomfortable question. Are we really just discovering AI? Or are we only just now being allowed to talk about it in public? Because that is not the same thing either. Public release is one thing. Private use is another. Mass adoption is one thing. Quiet development is another. And if you know anything about technology, You know this pattern is not exactly shocking. Things usually do not appear in public the moment they become possible. They appear when they are ready, when the market is ready, when the story around them is ready. So is it really so crazy to wonder whether machine-assisted composition, pattern extraction, predictive shaping, and all kinds of hidden forms of musical automation were already further along than most people realized? Not in the sense of a cartoon conspiracy, in the sense of incentives. Think about the timeline. By the early 2000s, culture was already being broken into data. Sound, image, language, behavior, all of it increasingly captured, indexed, measured, processed. MIDI had already been around for years by then. Digital production was normalizing, and the logic of computer-mediated music was no longer strange. MIDI itself goes back to the early 1980s, and algorithmic or AI-related music research goes back much earlier than most people imagine. So when people act as if all of this came out of nowhere, all at once, with the recent boom of public-facing tools, I cannot help but wonder, really? Was nothing like this being explored 15 or 20 years ago? Was nobody with money, data, infrastructure, and commercial incentive pushing in this direction behind the scenes? I am not saying I can prove that the biggest artists were all secretly using some magical black box in 2005. That would be a different claim, and a serious one. I am saying the question is not absurd, because once music became data, and once taste became measurable, and once culture itself became something platforms could model, sort, predict, and feed back to us, the path toward this moment was already there. Maybe that is why this feels less like an invasion and more like a reveal. Maybe we are not watching a brand new reality arrive. Maybe we are finally seeing, in public, the shape of a reality that has been forming for a long time. And if that is true, then the panic makes even more sense. Because people are not just reacting to a new tool, they are reacting to the possibility that the game was already changing while they were still being told the old story. And that possibility is devastating. Because it means the mirror is not only showing us what AI can do, it is showing us what the culture has already become. We have ancient instruments from Greece and Rome. We have liturgical chant stretching back through the early centuries of Christianity. Gregorian chant, as a codified tradition, reaches back more than a millennium, and instrumental music long predates recording by thousands of years. So what exactly are we saying when we talk as if music only becomes real once it enters the registry of ownership? Do you think Beethoven sat there thinking, I need to make sure this melodic gesture is protected in all territories? Do you think Mozart was running to an office to file forms so no one could imitate an idea? Do you think Bach, with 20 children and a relentless workload, is remembered because he optimized a royalty strategy? Bach died at 65 and fathered 20 children. Mozart died at 35. Beethoven died at 56. And yet, when we speak their names, we do not remember them as rights managers. We remember them as musicians. We remember the work. We remember the force. We remember the sound. And yes, before someone jumps in, I know they needed patrons, commissions, teaching, church positions, opera income, court appointments. Of course, musicians have always had to survive. This is not about romanticizing poverty. This is not about pretending economics did not exist. It is about proportion. It is about whether survival remained in service of the art, or whether the art has now been placed in service of the monetization model. That is a different thing. And I suspect many of us have been living inside that inversion for so long that it feels normal. That is how conditioning works. Not always through force, through familiarity. You live in a system long enough, and eventually you stop noticing its assumptions. So now AI appears, and immediately people say, theft. Maybe sometimes they are right in a legal sense. I am not denying legal disputes exist. Copyright itself is not some tiny recent invention. The Berne Convention was adopted in 1886 and became a major international basis for protecting authors' and composers' rights. But that is exactly why this conversation matters. Because once a legal framework becomes old enough and powerful enough, people begin to mistake it for nature. And it is not nature. It is a system. A system with strengths, yes. A system with protections, yes. A system that can help creators, yes. But still, a system. Music is older than that system. Human song is older than that system. The need to make rhythm, melody, lament, celebration, prayer, memory, dance, grief, seduction, transcendence, community and identity through sound is older than that system. So when AI shakes the system and everybody loses their mind, I think it is fair to ask, what exactly is being threatened? Music, or the terms under which music has recently been monetized? Because those are not identical. And now we have to talk about technology itself. This is another part that feels crazy to me. People speak as if AI has suddenly introduced artificiality into music. Really? What have we been listening to for decades? Are you telling me the modern listener grew up in some untouched Eden of pure acoustic truth? No. Come on. Editing, layering, tuning, timing correction, sample replacement, synthetic textures, cut and paste production, drum grids, MIDI orchestration, pitch processing, vocal comping, hyper-compressed masters. All of that has been normal for years. The line between performance and construction has been negotiated over and over already. So now the outrage is, this tool is too far. Why is it too far? Because it is more artificial? Or because it reveals how artificial the surrounding ecosystem already was? That is the uncomfortable thought. Not that AI appeared out of nowhere and contaminated a previously holy industry, but that AI may be the mirror nobody wanted. And mirrors are offensive when people are invested in illusion. Then there is a huge landmark, the second elephant in the room. In the early 2000s, the mask slipped. A group that had once embodied the energy of the outsider, the garage, the rebellion, the anti-establishment instinct, crossed over and stood with the machinery of control. And maybe that was the moment a lot of people should have realized what was happening. Not just legally, spiritually, culturally, symbolically. Because when the ones who came from the underground begin defending the fortress, something has gone rotten. And the truly dystopian part is that people still cheered. We have been so trained to worship power once it becomes successful that we barely notice the betrayal when it happens. Fiction warns us about these characters all the time. The ones who sell out the cause, who trade the fire for protection, who join the empire and then pretend it was wisdom. But when that story plays out in music, in public, in front of everyone, we call it maturity, we call it business, we call it justified. Wow. Maybe that is one of the clearest signs that we have been brainwashed for a very long time. And what did that era teach people? It taught them that the battlefield was ownership, yes, but more than that, It taught them that once power is close enough to taste, people will commit treason against the very thing they once claimed to defend. Not treason in the legal sense, something worse. A betrayal of spirit, a betrayal of origin, a betrayal of the underground by the very people who rose from it. And somehow, we were told to admire that. Wow. Again, I understand the legal logic, but culturally, spiritually, psychologically, what did that teach a generation of musicians and listeners? Did it teach them to ask what music is for? Or did it teach them to ask who gets paid when music moves? That is not a trivial distinction. Because once your imagination is framed that way for long enough, eventually the whole world starts looking like a licensing problem. And then AI walks in, and of course the first instinct is not wonder, not discernment, not serious philosophical examination. The first instinct is territorial panic. Who owns the output? Who trained the model? Who is owed? Who can sue? Who can block? Who can control? Do you see what I mean? I'm not saying these questions never matter. I am saying the speed with which they dominate the conversation should concern us. Because it suggests that what we love may already be subordinate to what we fear losing. And that is where I think the real danger is. Not AI replacing human music in some simplistic, apocalyptic sense, but human beings becoming so psychologically dependent on a monetized conception of art that they no longer know how to defend music except in the language of property. That is bleak. That is a much deeper problem. And here is the point where people get nervous, because they think I'm saying musicians should not care about money. That is not what I am saying. I am saying musicians should care about money in its place. Money is a tool. Music is not. Royalties are a mechanism. Music is not. Copyright is a framework. Music is not. And when the mechanism becomes sacred, while the source becomes secondary, something has gone wrong. Maybe badly wrong. Maybe this is why so much music feels dead on arrival now. Not because technology made it dead, because it was already being approached from the wrong center. And yes, let me go one step further. Would it really shock you if large commercial systems have already been using machine-assisted processes, predictive analytics, audience modeling, and increasingly automated pattern extraction for far longer than the public conversation admits? I'm not making a courtroom claim there. I am making an observation about incentives. Why would the largest industries on Earth not use every available tool to reduce risk, shape taste, and optimize output? Of course they would. So then why is the public debate always staged as if the innocence was intact until yesterday? That is what feels fake. That is what feels managed. And that is why I keep coming back to the same phrase. Things may not be as they seem. Maybe the sharks are not where we are being told to look. Maybe the threat is not simply the machine outside us. Maybe the deeper threat is what the system has trained us to worship inside us. Security, control, repeatability, legal enclosure, monetized identity. Maybe we have been cornered into treating our own artistic life as a portfolio. And maybe that is why people feel spiritually exhausted around music, even while they consume more of it than ever. Because abundance is not the same as nourishment. A soundtrack is not the same as meaning. Infinite replay is not the same as beauty. And convenience is not the same as truth. That may be why that old remembered image from Lewis bothers me so much. The refusal to treat beauty like a vending machine. The refusal to flatten music into demand fulfillment. That attitude feels almost impossible to imagine now because we have normalized instant repetition, infinite access, and emotional outsourcing. We want the song again because we want the feeling again, because we do not know how to bear the silence in between. Wow. that is not just a technology problem. That is a formation problem, a spiritual problem, a cultural problem, an attention problem. And now, AI enters that cracked landscape, and everyone says, this is the crisis. Maybe. But I do not think that is the whole story. I think AI is a test of whether we still know what cannot be automated, a test of whether musicians remember that the real center of the craft was never mere output, a test of whether listeners can still feel the difference between something assembled for consumption and something born from lived encounter. And maybe, more painfully, it is a test of whether we have the courage to admit that the industry did not merely support music. At times, it also distorted it. So what do we do with that? I'm not giving a policy answer here. I'm not pretending there are no legal issues. I'm not saying everybody should abandon protection or pretend exploitation is fine. I am saying the conversation has to get deeper, much deeper. Before we talk about what AI is doing to music, maybe we need to ask what we have already done to music. Before we panic about synthetic creation, maybe we need to ask why so much of culture had already become synthetic in its values. Before we scream that the machine is dehumanizing art, maybe we need to ask how much dehumanization we accepted as normal as long as it paid. Those are harder questions, but they are better questions, and they may lead somewhere real. Because if music is truly human, then AI does not destroy that. It pressures it. It exposes weak points. It forces a distinction. It makes shallow imitation easier, yes. But in doing so, it may also force human beings back toward depth, toward embodiment, toward risk, toward presence, toward interpretation, toward voice, toward soul, toward all the things that cannot be reduced to pattern output. And if that happens, then the story is not simply technological decline. It might also be a brutal kind of purification. Not comfortable, not clean, not fair in every case, but clarifying. So I will leave it there, not with an answer, but with the question that keeps bothering me. Are we really afraid that AI will destroy music? Or are we finally being forced to notice how thoroughly we allowed music to be reframed before AI ever arrived? Maybe things are not as they seem. Maybe the problem is not only what the machine is doing. Maybe the problem is what we have been taught to love. And maybe the deepest question now is not whether AI is dangerous. Maybe the deepest question is this: are we brainwashed about what music is?